Welcome, everyone. We're here with Dr. Compost.
Hello, everyone.
And yeah.
Well, we have a bunch of questions to get through, and if people show up, we'll of course prioritize them as they come. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and get through some of the questions people put to us.
Okay, so we had first one was from Merlin. He was saying that most of my worms have drowned. I just got the pod was half full of rainwater.
Yeah, there's been a lot of places with heavy rain, especially in the Pacific Northwest with all those atmospheric river conditions. It can really be a difficult situation. Even if you're in a raised garden bed, probably the best thing to do there is to try to drape a tarp over the bed when you know one of those events is coming. So what'll happen is the rain can actually come down through the soil and come in through the walls when it's really crazy heavy rain. So the best thing is just to tarp it in some way if you don't have a covering over the top of the bed. And then unfortunately, this is kind of the scenario where if you're in ground, it's really difficult because if you are burying your subpod in the ground, it's an application that will put the worms at risk when there's very heavy rains because the soil tends to get a lot of water if it's not an incredibly good draining soil, and then it's more likely to flood things out. So the good news is that worms can survive for at least a day or so waterlogged. And so if you catch it early enough, what I would recommend is just removing the worms that are present still after the heavy rain, and then basically keeping them out of the heavy weather events. But normally what will happen is if you wait a couple of days, the worms will flee because they actually drown if they're underwater for too long. So yes, finding some way to keep them out of the rain is good when you've got those heavy events happening.
Yeah, and as you said, if you're planting in the soil, don't put it in the low part of the garden.
Right, that's definitely the case. Hi, Darrin. It looks like you've just joined us. If we always give priority to people who come live, so if you've got questions for us, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away.
Okay, thank you. Is the sound coming out okay?
Yes, it's coming out well.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, first time calling in. I just set up a system with a little grow bed around it.
Great.
Set up a few weeks ago, I guess. And yeah, I kind of had the typical where a lot of people posted where I had an initial set of worms put in and kind of follow directions, and then they just seem to scatter.
Yeah.
We've had some cooler temperatures. I'm in Florida, so it's relatively cooler compared to a lot of places. It's warming up now, but I guess my question is, I do see them, but they seem to have kind of dispersed quite a bit, and I've tried to be fairly moderate in terms of how much composting material I put in. But I guess I'm just wondering if I should just be patient and kind of let the process unfold.
Well, I'll
more weeks, or if I'm
I'll help guide you for that way. So number one question I have is, what kind of bedding did you put in for the worms?
I used that coconut coir material. I had, and then also, yeah, I had that, and also some potting soil I kind of had with it as well. Sort of a mix of the two, I suppose. To start.
So I think this is a common confusion, is that compost worms are a little different than regular earthworms. And so they actually prefer to hang out in entirely organic matter rather than soil. That's their preference. So in nature, they tend to live really right at the top of the soil level. As leaf litter falls and creates that sort of surface duff, they tend to be hanging out there. So you'd want to pretty much just stick with the coir. If you did a 50-50 mix, what I would recommend is adding just entirely some coconut coir above that, and then seeing if they mostly migrate to that, because they'll like a lighter kind of medium to move around in. They're sort of specialists. They like to really focus on breaking down organic matter. They get through it a much higher rate than earthworms. So that could be part of it. And then yeah, your thing in the beginning is, as they're new to this environment, you just want to give them the best possible environment, which is why the coconut coir is a really good choice, because it'll bring in lots of air, it'll bring in lots of moisture, and then it's just a matter of not overfeeding. So if you're just putting in a small amount of food chopped up. Little by
Mhm.
little, they'll be eating that and creating compost worm castings. And gradually, they'll create their own microenvironment that they love. And so it's only in the beginning that you are sort of nursing them along. So
Yeah,
how does that sound?
that sounds good. Yeah, so I'll probably add some more of that coir, um, limit adding more uh, compost material until they can kind of get a little bit more settled. It sounds like,
Yeah,
but yeah,
that's
we'll
it.
do for sure.
And then just focus on the soft foods that break down quickly in the beginning. So the soft vegetables, the soft fruits, chop them up. And by using the soft foods, they break down faster. And you're trying to favor bringing a lot of microbes into that material because the worms are eating the microbes as much as the foods. So it just helps them get going, and you'll start to see after a few weeks the number of worms getting, well, first you'll see them getting larger because I imagine when they first arrive, they're not so big, right? Are they
Hmm.
smaller
Yeah, they're a
worms?
little skinny.
Yeah, yeah, they'll
They're in
fatten up if
shock.
you,
I can tell. Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, I do have
yeah,
what? Can I ask one more question?
sure,
Sorry, and
yeah,
then
ask
that's
away.
my questions.
Uh-huh.
What was it? Uh, oh, shoot, I just lost my question. I'll think of it here in a second.
Okay.
Um, compost.
Oh, you,
Yeah, I forgot it. Sorry.
oh, yeah,
I'll
no
think of it.
problem. If it occurs to you during the time we're doing the session, just, raise your hand or break in. Let us know that you've remembered it. But we're just basically,
Great, thank
because
you.
you're the only live person so far that's shown up, we're going
Oh,
through the questions people have posted on the site. So yeah, that's, you have our full attention so
oh,
far.
I
So,
just thought of it now.
oh,
Sorry,
good.
had to think
Okay.
there for a second. You got me off guard. Um, so bugs, right? So I did look on the community site, and I saw a few people had posted. I have seen, and I haven't identified all of them. Probably 3 or 4 different types of bugs,
Yeah.
different, and I don't know, and not like infested, but certainly
Hmm.
I've seen some, and I've been kind of curious if, just to kind of, I've been monitoring it, but like I said, it's been 3 or 4 different types of little insects, and I'm not sure if I should be, you know, not
Yeah.
concerned, but just thinking about that as a potential issue, or is it sort of typical you're going to see some of that happening? Not so much
Y-
flies, but more of just little critters that crawl around. I don't know
Yeah.
what kind they
Yeah. So there's a class of small insects that are actually companion insects that help break down the food waste. So,
are.
the
Okay.
fancy name for some of those is arthropods. So these would be like the tiny beetles and the
Yeah.
springtails. You might see some little tiny, like almost white guys bouncing around, or little super small black beetles crawling around. And they're actually companion animals that will help the worms in breaking down the food. And so
Okay.
generally they coexist with the worms really well. And what you're looking out for, though, is if you see a lot of one thing start to really show up, that could be a sign of, make sure that the moisture levels are right. So you want the bedding to be moist but not dripping wet and not too dry.
Hmm.
So if, as long as you're optimizing the environment for the worms, then they'll tend to be the dominant members. And then the other thing is just pay attention to the soil levels to make sure that the soil around the bed doesn't subside so that flies can fly in and be
Got it.
annoying. But it sounds
Okay.
like you're doing
Perfect.
pretty
Thank you.
well. And Florida is actually going to be a great place to have the system going because you guys have such a mild climate there. I'm not sure, are you in the northern or southern part of the state?
Yeah, I'm in northern Florida,
Okay.
and we do get a lot of sun, obviously, but I think I'm in a pretty good spot because I've got it set up next to kind of a large hedge. So there is a lot of sunlight, but
Hmm.
it does create shade later in the day so
Right.
the way it's set up, I think it's going to work pretty well.
Cool.
I'm hopeful, but we'll see.
Yeah,
But yeah, thank
well,
you.
good luck. And yeah, don't hesitate if you've got more questions. And yeah, you'll see any plants you grow around the Subpod are going to do particularly well because they
Awesome.
love being right next to the compost as it's being generated.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, Catherine, you want to ask?
Okay, back to the questions. Thanks, Darrin. It's always good to have someone here live. So Mary Jordan from the Grow Hub, she was asking about Should I add compost to my garden beds if the soil is covered with a thick layer of pine bark mulch?
Yeah, so mulch is always a good idea to put on top of the soil to protect it from the sun, both so it doesn't dry out and also to shield the microbes in the soil from the intense rays of the sun, the UV especially. So what you'll have to do when you want to add the compost is peel back that layer of mulch in the area where you want to add the compost. So typically you might want to have a bucket to one side and scoop handfuls of the mulch that you're using into the bucket. Maybe top dress, that's a fancy word for scattering your compost around the plant that you want to add it to, and then just scoop it out of the bucket and add it back, add the compost back on, sorry, add the mulch back on top of the compost to bring the bed back. So yeah, that's really a nice way to set up a bed is you've got the soil medium that you're growing things in. You can be adding compost a little bit to the upper layers and then just add your mulch back afterwards and should be fine.
Right. Yeah, I'm a big fan of mulch. Right. Okay, and Mary had another question. She said, what spices and herbs may not be suitable for the worms? I do not use tea bags, but rather loose tea and indulge in a number of different blends. For example, one is heavy with cinnamon. It doesn't have cinnamon bark in it, but a lot of ground up cinnamon. It also has cloves, and as a tea, it brews up quite hot and spicy. I wonder if this kind of thing is okay for the worms, and then what other herbs or spices might be of concern, or are they all okay?
So my rule of thumb is basically the more bedding you've got in your subpod chamber, the more you can be diluting out anything you're not sure about to spread it around the subpod. And that gives the worms a choice so that they're not crowded into something they don't like. But generally the culinary spices like cinnamon and nutmeg and the various peppers and things, they're not problems. I would avoid salt if you can. Don't try not to add heavy salt. Worms definitely don't like a lot of salt around them because their skin is susceptible to drying out if you have heavily salted food. So generally that's the best. So if you actually are someone who loves salty food, then you probably want to rinse your scraps a little bit to rinse some of the salt off to reduce the amount of salt a little bit. And then chili is something they wouldn't be so fond of, but if you're spreading this through the bedding, that's really going to give them the chance to move away from what they don't like. So it's actually a collaboration between the microbes and the worms, where the worms will go after stuff that they're ready to eat and things that they want to avoid. Say, for example, really fresh onions and skins. They can be sitting in one corner, the microbes break them down, and then once they're soft and partly decomposed, the worms will come running. So that's generally the way to think about the system. And what you'll find is as your chamber gets fuller and fuller with the castings, you can be much more relaxed about what you're adding. It's really in the beginning when you're just starting at the system that you want to really give them the foods they most like. So if you look at the instructions in the lid, that shows you the foods they most favor and chop them up. But once the system's been going for 5 months or thereabouts, you'll find that the worms are very, very forgiving of lots of things you want to be adding, as long as you're stirring it through.
Yeah, mine's so robust now. It's like it's got its own little microecology, and now I can throw anything in.
Yeah, it's good. What you're doing is you're actually creating a whole matrix environment where all the microbes in that bedding are actively breaking things down. So immediately when you're adding food to a mature system like Catherine's, all the active microbial life in there is really pouncing on that food and breaking it down quickly. And that just, you'll see that food disappears. It's amazing. You can have a bucket full of food scraps within a couple of days, it's gone.
Yeah. And very forgiving once they get themselves,
established.
Yeah. It's just in the beginning phases, as you said.
Okay, next question.
Okay, next one here is, how long should I wait in the spring to see if my worms come back versus accepting that they probably died over winter? It was a mild winter and the ground never froze. Air temps went below freezing a few times. Current average temps 40 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. She's in Virginia.
Mhm.
My Subpod mini is buried in the ground with a homemade cold frame over it.
Okay.
I have been aerating and adding carbon 1 to 2 times a week and only see 1 to 2 worms each time. No increase in the number of worms when I added a banana peel. I just got some coffee grounds and we'll try that next.
So with those mild conditions and the cold frame, she could have easily been feeding all winter long. So I'm guessing if she stopped feeding, the worms would have probably been active enough that they would have been hungry and looking for food elsewhere. And so they're likely still in the bed, and you just want to add in their favorite foods to bring them back. So yeah, coffee grounds is one choice. Avocado is another, bananas another. These softer foods are things that they'll really like. Pumpkin's another great one. So it's always the thing in winter, you'll get experience over time that once your system is going, you just provide a bit of shelter if you're in a colder climate. We've got some great resources to kind of guide people how to keep the worms happy through the winter, and you just keep feeding them all the way through the cold months. Or if you're in a really, really cold place, some people will actually bring some indoors so that you don't have the hassle of going out chipping through the snow to feed your compost waste to the worms, and then take them back out when the weather's nicer.
Great. All right. Yeah, there's in the Grow Hub, there's the winter composting. We've got a little article there, and we'll be adding more and more. But yeah, there's some great tips that have even come in from all our compost members over there in the Northern Hemisphere. So yeah, lots of tips around the winter and starting them back up again in spring. So another question here is, does everything I add to the Subpod need to be made into tiny bits? How small should anything be? For instance, banana peels, eggshells, apples past their prime, etc.
So there's two reasons to cut the food up. And normally the easy thing is when you're adding stuff to a kitchen caddy where you're collecting the food waste, just giving food a rough chop is enough. And the two reasons why you'd want to be chopping up the food, and we're talking about coarse chopping, not fine chopping. Just, if you're using English units, maybe 1.5 pieces would be fine. The idea is that you want those scraps to actually tuck into the bedding rather than sitting on top. So the bigger the pieces, the more likely they are to sit on top. What happens if that occurs is they'll dry out and decompose more slowly, and they might attract pests. So by chopping them up, it's easier to incorporate that through the bedding, and they break down faster. The other thing is, if you're just starting out your system, you're taking that new material that's bedding and you're trying to inoculate that with food for the microbes. And so by either pureeing the food or chopping it really finely, you're fast tracking the ability of that food to break down and starting to build up a really healthy population of microbes that then work as a team with the worms to decompose the food waste. So once your system is starting underway for, say, a couple months, there's no need to be chopping things fine. Just coarsely chopped is helpful. And yeah, you don't have to be too pedantic about this. Just coarsely chopped is good.
I think it's how fast do you want to get through your food waste.
Yeah, yeah.
And she said a sub question was that I've read that eggshells must be baked and then ground up before added. What's this about, and is it necessary?
So this is where people are trying to get that calcium into the soil, into the compost as quickly as they can. And obviously in the beginning, that calcium's in a matrix bound up in the shell. And so it's not very bioavailable in that form. So crushing it and powdering it and baking it are strategies to make it get into the soil faster. But honestly, it's totally not necessary. You can just crush it into little pieces. Just take your hand and crush it up before you throw it in the kitchen caddy is fine. The idea is that if you leave them as large pieces and the worms crawl over the sharp surfaces, they may get a bit cut on those surfaces. By chopping it up, you're reducing the risk of injuring worms. But the calcium will gradually assimilate into the soil, but it doesn't have to go fast. it's fine.
Great. Okay, so now we have another from Sandy. She's had great success with her Subpod, but her question is, the compost is a rich black, so I need to harvest it.
Sounds great.
But is it too cold for that? And do you recommend waiting a while? Our nights in Utah are still at 30 degrees Fahrenheit and are starting to hit the 50s, and the soil temp yesterday in the Subpod was 45. Our last frost date is typically around May, but May the 8th. By the way, I have Subpod Mini, so I don't have 2 bins to work with.
Okay, so the good news is that black material means it's got lots of healthy microbes in, and it's providing a buffer for the worms through the cold months. So it's true, you don't want to prematurely harvest it. If it's getting so full that you're having trouble adding food without it sort of spewing, falling out of the chamber and everything, then I'd recommend a partial harvest where you would just take a few handfuls. And the easy way to do that when it's a single chamber, as you've got, is you could start selectively, strategically putting food on one side of the mini, and then the worms will move over to that. You'll enrich for worms in the region around the food. And if you're only doing a partial harvest, then you can take a handful of castings from the side where you're not putting the food and just make a little mound of that. And the worms will avoid the light. So if you put your mound onto a dark colored board and you have it in the sun, by scraping the outer edges of the mound, the worms will retreat into the middle of the mound, and you can harvest some of that compost. And you can do maybe just a small bucket of that, and that'll provide you with some material. If you're also wanting to wait to apply that to your plants when they're growing, it's fine to store it in the dark in a cool place with a loosely covered lid, and just make sure it doesn't dry out. You can sprinkle it, and then when the plants are starting to kick into spring, then you can go ahead and add it to them. But otherwise, you can wait until the weather's warmer if it's not all the way up to the aeration panels on the mini. And then I'm going to provide other more detailed tips about how to harvest from the mini. I think there's one article that I previously generated online. I'm not sure it's active at the moment, but we'll make sure for people that they can get access to it as well.
Great. And then the importance of not having a sealed lid, you say about harvesting.
Loosely fitted. So the idea is that compost is a living material. It's exchanging air, it's respirating. And so you want to make sure to provide air and water, so that by having a lid that just sits loosely on top, air is able to get into the compost and keep it from going into an anaerobic state, which makes you lose some of the vitality of the compost.
Which is a bit like soil. Like, I only recently worked out that soil also needs air and moisture, and not too much moisture or too little, or the extreme between one or the other.
It's true. It's true. So there's 3 gases in the air that the living animals and plants require from that air. They need the oxygen, they need the nitrogen, and they need the carbon dioxide. All 3 of those are helpful for the plants. So generally you want to have a lightweight, either we're talking about soil, a lightweight soil so that air can get in, or if you're talking about the compost, make sure it's also got access to the air so that the microbes can utilize those gases.
I guess all living things need.
Yeah, they're either taking in oxygen if they're animals to respirate, or they're taking in CO2 if they're plants to build plant tissue. And actually, they both need each to some extent, but that's another conversation.
Yeah, great. And then second question from Sandy is, there are so many questions in the fall about how to winterize our subpods. Now that it is spring, is there any advice on waking it up for the spring? I've had my system for 9 months, so I'm still experiencing a lot of firsts.
Oh yeah, great. So depending on the situation, how much you've nursed them through the cold time of the year, if they're active, then you're just gradually adding food and watching to see how quickly it disappears. So they obviously become less active as it cools off. And in extreme cases, they actually go into a total quiescent state where only the eggs are surviving and they have to hatch. And you'll get tiny worms initially, and you're feeding small amounts as they get larger. So it's a matter of adding small amounts and then watching to see how fast it disappears, little by little, step by step.
Okay, well, that's all the questions that I've got here in the event that was shared with us.
Okay.
So I thought I'd check. Darrin, did you have anything else that you wanted to touch on at this point? And,
Yeah, I did think of, thank you. I did think of one question. You spoke to it, but I was wondering if it's in doing some of the aerating or kind of moving the mixture around and kind of, I was just wondering if it's possible to harm the worms, like if they, they get bounced around and maybe they don't like that. Like, I don't know. I was thinking, am I hurting them by like shuffling the deck here?
Yeah, no, it's fine if what you want to do is just do that when you're adding the food. So what we've noticed is if you aren't doing it every single day, so you're better off letting your food build up for a few days and adding it all at once and stirring it in, and then giving the worms a few days to kind of travel around with it. That works fine. And
that's kind of what I've been doing. Like every 3 or 4 days, I'll give it a little bit of a stir, but I try to leave it for a few days to kind of let them do their thing.
Yeah, no, that's your instincts are very good. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the tip of the aerator is designed to go in sideways as it helps fluff in, and so the only risk is if you are pushing the tip of the aerator against the wall of the subpod and you manage to pin a worm there. That's the only way I could imagine the worms could get hurt, but it's designed to mostly just fluff things up and move things around, and it's great for the worms. It can compress over time without the aeration, and so by aerating when you're adding the food, you're doing two things. You're mixing the food scraps through the compost, and then you're also fluffing up the media to bring in more air from top to bottom.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And look, another question just came in from Nicole Lindsay.
Okay.
I got my worms in the past weekend, and they're currently acclimatizing to the Subpod Mini. I opened it today though, and lots of the worms were clumped near the top at the lid. Could this mean we are looking to get out to find something we don't have for them in their bin? We put some cardboard, coconut core, and parsley in there to start them off.
So I would be providing a food that they really especially would like. The parsley initially has to break down, and when you thinking from a worm's perspective, they want to have foods that really have a lot of bacterial activity. So, for example, a piece of bread that you soaked in water would be a great choice. Because that's providing a lot of surface for mold to grow that then the worms can eat. Soft foods like a bit of leftover cooked potato or some pumpkin or sweet potato. So when you think of soft foods that are breaking down quickly, those are the very best ones to add. And so you can add small amounts of those foods and the worms will like it. Usually when you're seeing that clumping at the top, there's two reasons for it. One is if the rain's on the way, they tend to go to higher ground to get away from the wet. It's sort of an instinctual behavior when the barometric pressure drops. But if the environment inside isn't to their liking, they are trying to get away. So that's the second reason they could be doing that. And that's one of the reasons I'm always suggesting when people are setting up their systems to use the hydrated coconut core as the ideal bedding, because it's the closest approximation to an ideal worm habitat. It's moist, it's bringing in the air. They're going to be comfortable there while they're settling in, and then it has enough structure that it's not going to collapse too quickly. So if this person doesn't have coconut core in their system, then I would recommend. She does. Okay, good.
My only question around that is is there anything that can be in some of those coconut core peats that they wouldn't like, or do you think they're all pretty good?
They're usually quality control checked for salinity. That's the one thing that can happen if you have a a mix that hasn't been from reputable source, then the saline could be too high. But normally what happens is all of the processed shredded coconut is always evaluated to make sure the salt levels aren't high, because often this is harvested around the ocean where the coconuts are growing. And if you have husks that have soaked in seawater, then you've got to get rid of that salt before you can use it as a
Right.
material.
Okay. So in that case, if there was a lot of salt, what would you, how to balance it out?
Well, they if they're buying it from a normal like store that sells the compressed bricks, that wouldn't have it in it. But
Right.
Yeah, unless they got a manufacturing batch that was bad.
Yeah.
So the other option is, if you want to be absolutely safe, and you have access to it, if you have leaves that have rotted down well, not freshly fallen leaves or just dry leaves, but leaves that have been rotting through a season or so, so they're partly decomposed, that's actually a pretty good source because it has those features of having a bit of loft from the structure of the leaf. Leaves actually take a surprising amount of time to break down initially. So as you let them start to decompose, they're kind of an ideal in-between point where they're not all the way down to the leaf molds, but they're not all the way in that dry form. And that can be a good bedding. That's actually a bedding that approximates the natural habitat for the worms, and it provides some of the microbes that are on the leaves. So that's a good thing to add if you've got access to it as well. It's just a harder thing to come by for people that live in urban areas.
Right. Right. Love that answer. Okay, so let me see if there's anything else. I think that's probably about it that I can see for now. That's our half an hour. Do we usually do half an hour?
Yeah, I think we're good for now for this week. And
Wonderful.
of course, if you have a burning question, please add it to the section, and I'll be happy to get through it.
And then the next Dr. Compost session, we usually do it once a month. So if we're looking at April, the last Thursday in April is usually our time, the 27th. Are you going to be good for that, Peter?
Yeah, that'll work.
Great.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll create another Dr. Compost on the 27th of April. I'll share that event, and Darrin or anyone out there who's listening to this recording, please add your questions to the event. Yeah, Peter can, or you can also tag Peter Howard in the Grow Hub, and he'll get back to you if it's more urgent than that.
Yeah, if you don't have to wait a whole month.
Yeah. So wonderful. Look, thanks, Peter, always.
Thanks so
for your
much.
great,
Yeah, enjoyed it.
Yeah, you're
knowledge and
welcome.
experience.
Yeah,
and
happy
thanks, Darrin, for coming. It's always great to have someone else here in person. So yeah, wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah,
Good.
very much
Happy
enjoyed
composting.
it. Take care. Thank you.
You too.
Ah.
Bye.